try and run a tight ship here and stay on schedule to the extent that's possible. In an event such as this, welcome everybody. I'm Jonathan Cole. I'm the Acting Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, and this is the third Theological Disputes lecture in our series, and we're really privileged to have Professor Wayne Hudson delivering it today. Before I introduce Wayne, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which this gathering takes place today, and I'd like to, that's the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Now Wayne has one of those CVs that really would take up most of our time to get through, because you can't even whittle it down to the most important or prestigious elements. So, and I realise he's well known to many of you, so I'm just going to go off script and offer a couple of personal observations and reflections on Wayne. I think, in my view, and perhaps in your view, it would be fair to describe Wayne as one of perhaps Australia's greatest intellectual historians, and so it's a real treat to have him as one of our research professors at both the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, and also the new research vehicle that we have called the Centre for Religion, Ethics and Society. Wayne is a very unique intellectual in that he has an unsurpassed breadth of knowledge, to the extent where he can tell you interesting political, cultural and historical facts about the most obscure countries on the planet, and then convince you that they are somehow integral to the future of civilization. And not only does he have this really unbelievable breadth of knowledge, both synchronic and diachronic, every historical age, every civilization and culture just about you can think of, he also uniquely is a world-leading authority in, he told me once by the printer, not 1, 2, 3, but 4 discrete areas. I can't remember every single one of them, but he is a world-leading authority on the German Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch, who's met, I think, twice and written one of the big books on his thought. He's also a world-leading authority on English deism. Wayne, I don't know if one of the third was religious thought in Australia, because you have written a very unique book there, and I don't know what the fourth one is, or maybe you've acquired a fifth one since that conversation by the printer a couple of years ago. I know this sounds slightly hyperbolic, but those of you who are familiar with Wayne's intellect will know that this is one particular mind where you can't do hyperbolic, and so Wayne, with that non-hyperbolic but hyperbolic sounding introduction, where I used the word 1,000 times, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I think Jonathan's introduced me extremely well, so you know the kind of lunatic I am, and the only question is, well, when will I stop? This is a complex, dense and far-ranging paper, so what I've done with it is I've tried to get it within the 30 minutes or so, and to make it really easy, I've come up with a little leitmotif, so that everyone who's come will know what I said when you leave. And I've made it really easy, but as you'll discover, really hard. The really easy bit is spider's dream. So all I'm saying today is spider's dream. So you've now got it. So when someone says to you, what did he say? Oh, he said spider's dream. Yes, well, that's all he's saying. Spider's dream. I'll just gloss that slightly and you'll get into the theme. Modern approaches to imagination are mistaken. Imagination and counterfactuality are not false, but evolutionary resources. Modern religious thought accepted factuality as a norm, forgetting, Vico, that facts are made, factum. The new religious thought will work with and beyond it. So I am making a case for a new religious thought at the end. It is a case for a religious thought that moves beyond made facts. So you see the thrust of it is quite strong at the end. And I begin it and end it with the spider's dream idea, because it tells you immediately that imagination is not peculiar to human beings. The counterfactuality and transversion of order and causality are not faults that we make when we're muddled only, but intrinsic to organic life in universes like ours. And you can see already, I think, that this is very simple, very clear, but it does cut the basis of modern thought in certain respects. I've tried to keep it fairly simple, but there are limits. The modern world is ending, and modern thought and the modern sciences are slowly changing. We need a new religious thought that responds to this. Well, everyone says that, don't they? Some first indications can be found in 6 or so theoretical perspectives that I mentioned at the end. I don't give you the new religious thought, I'm sorry, because I don't know what it will be. I don't know what it should be. I'm all, like everyone else, struggling with the degree of change. But I do give you 6 examples of new theoretical perspectives that I think will help with it. Now, the paper is historical, sociological, and not a contribution to theology. I have no capacity to say anything about theology to anyone. Of course, I read theological books like many of you, and I have excellent theological colleagues. But it's not my discipline. If I have any reputation, it's not in that field. Of course, I hope that what I say will be of some help to theological colleagues, but only in the sense of stimulating their thoughts. I'm not trying to get them to adopt mine. Now, I also want to say it's important that this is not a contribution to prophecy. There have been great prophets, but I'm not one of them. So I'm not telling you what's going to happen or how it's going to work out. It's prospection in the French sense. It's not prophecy. What I'm doing, though, is historical sociological in the sense that I'm applying the methodologies I developed in Beyond Religion and the Secular. If you find all this totally unintelligible, buy the book. Buy the book. And if you think I say wild and dangerous things, buy the book. Because the book is not wild or dangerous, it's boring and extremely detailed. And it discusses Persian, Japanese, Bengali, Hindu, it's multi and very boring. But that's where the methodology can be found set out quite clearly, and you'll see there is a method behind what I say. So though it sounds a bit journalistic, you won't find it journalistic when you go to the text. You'll have the opposite trouble, that you may not know some of the words, and that's not your fault, that's my fault. So that's where I'm coming from. Now, in part 1, I suggest that we may now be able to move past some of the governing concepts of modern religious thought in the West. Only modern religious thought, only in the West, not the Eastern Church, for example. And I give you a short list of those, and I won't go through them too much, and they sound terribly controversial unless you go to the library. So yes, I don't think there's religion in an essentialist sense. Well, nobody's thought there was religion in an essentialist sense for 20 years who's in the field. Then I think the concept that reality can be equated with a meta-person called God is problematic. Now that alarms some people. Is he going to attack God and theism? No, it's a point about cultural anthropology. And if you don't understand the point, you read the book by Marshall Sahlins, the greatest book written for 50 years on the subject, which is about how meta-persons are the key to all societies, except ours. If you're interested in cultural anthropology, the book is Marshall Sahlins, Princeton, just out, absolutely fabulous. And it shows you it's not about theism, it's about how other societies understand ordinary life using meta-persons. And when you've understood that, you begin to see that we're a bit odd, because we've kept it in our theology, but not in our life. The idea that religion is about true or false beliefs, that's also not that controversial. Think of Schleiermacher, think of almost any great modern theologian. The notion that a form of non-contextual revelation is possible, well, I don't think that's controversial either. I mean, obviously anyone talking about revelation in theology talks about context and discusses enculturation, the context in which it occurs, the context in which it's received. It's just that some people do have what I would call the sort of weird idea that propositions descend from heaven. And I mean, that's a papal idea, it's sometimes a conservative reform idea. And the question is, where are they? And some people say, well, they're in Holy Scripture. But there you have to go to context, that's the point of that point. Not to deny revelation, but to say the context is central. And then I do deny that there's a dualism between the religion and the secular. That's been a cliche in the field for a very long time. But people don't see the implications. Everybody says, yeah, you can't have that dualism. Well, if you can't have that dualism, how do you reorganize work? What do you do about sport? What's the problem about gymnasiums and brothels? No one says anything about that. Okay. Now you can see how I'm going from grand statements to historical, sociological stuff to a bit more prospective and controversial stuff. And if you're interested in those controversial first points, there are chapters on that in the next book I'm writing called Beyond Atheism and Post-Religion. So if you're interested in one of the points, read the chapter. I now want to go to the second part of the paper, and this is a bit of a rush through everything, but that's our world, it's not just me, it's the world. We have to respond now to a whole series of changes, and I can't go through all of them, but I do in this document go through about 20 of them. I'll try to find maybe 5 or 6 just for this audience, but you'll get the feel that there are changes, and we all know that. And I go through a great many of them. The end of European hegemony and white supremacy, multiraciality, decoloniality, that's the work of Castro. The end of the Renaissance disciplines, that's not discussed in Australia yet, but it's all over America. The Renaissance disciplines are ending, philosophy, literature, history. They're dying out, they won't be there in 20 years. The globalization of indigenous knowledges, that's huge, and we're all aware of that. Receptive ecumenism now applying to all indigenous cultures and to all other religious groups. And therefore affecting the way theological concepts and religious concepts can be formed. And then, of course, there's all the technological changes, artificial intelligence, genetic enhancement, nanotechnology, etc. We go through sexual transformations, the end of the male-female dualism and perhaps the nuclear family. We don't know that, but the whole traditional construction of gender in the West is under extreme stress. We all know that. And then, much more interesting to this audience, but also hard to deal in the time frame, how philosophy is changing. So I go through about 20 respects in which philosophy is changing. Now I won't go through them really today except to mention 1 or 2, but as I mention them you'll get the point that these are really fundamental changes. They're not little small things. You know, this is not an article somewhere in a journal saying, oh, I have a doubt about Mr. Hume, I have a doubt. No, it's not like that. So one of the changes is that the notion that reality exists is under serious stress in philosophy. The idea that reality exists. Now, in my day that wasn't a problem. Everyone was a sort of realist, and nobody knew what the word exist meant. And clever people had read Kant and knew that exist was not a predicate, according to Kant. And really clever people knew that thought that exist is a predicate. But nobody had a complex idea about exist, of course, because our languages don't do that. But Sanskrit had done it for 5,000 years. And now Sanskrit's arrived at Oxford, and yes, everybody's going into Sanskrit and not Greek. And yes, the Sanskrit literature on non-existence is central to the changes in philosophy. So if you're interested in the God-theism issue, is there a God who is not a God? That's not the problem. The problem is this exist word. Well, that's a massive change, because we didn't see that as a problem. If you're interested in that and you're a philosopher, read Graham Priest on that. He's the best in the world. Australian philosopher Graham Priest, absolutely brilliant, mathematical logician, but you can read every line, it's clear, it's simple, and it's persuasive. Second example would be the return of metaphysics. I can't go through that, but all serious philosophers are now working on metaphysics. They all agree it's the only game in town. Linguistic turn, cultural relativism, all the stuff that got theologians into a mess, in my view, is gone. You have to do metaphysics, and metaphysics requires modal logic. You can't do it if you can't do modal logic. And Catherine Pickstock, one of the greatest theologians in the world in a certain way at Cambridge, new religious metaphysics, brand new from Cambridge. I don't think anything she says is right, but she's certainly hard to understand. Now, a little bit more, because I'm trying to get to the end of this. A huge change in French philosophy. For the last 20 years, French philosophy was quite influential among uneducated people. It's now dropped dead. But not entirely, because there are 3 people in France who are not dead. Michel Henry, who is arguing for a non-Husserlian phenomenology, and Claude Romano, who comes regularly to Australia, and my friend Catherine Pickstock. Catherine Pickstock's the new French philosopher of plasticity. So a massive turn in France to the sciences and away from vagueness and fun. Well, that's an important change. Last one I might mention today is the revival of intellectual intuition. Now, analytic philosophy in the 20th century was heavily based on the idea that you can't have intellectual intuition. Now, this is a disastrously wrong idea. You can't have intellectual intuition. Well, that's now in the water again, because, of course, analytic philosophers could never really explain maths. They could never really explain how mathematics applies across the whole of the universe. They couldn't explain how that was possible. They couldn't explain how human beings got to that. And when they talked about language, they had great trouble with the maths professors, of course, who were bad at language. And then they tried numbers, but then really mathematical people don't believe in numbers, that's silly stuff. They go to abstract structure. So the point is that when you go to abstract structure, the intellectual intuition thing re-emerges. Because the challenge is to explain the possibility of the mathematics that works without introducing intellectual intuition. Now, coming back now to spiders dreaming again, you'll see the link. Because if you think there are human beings and they're on the earth and they're socio-cultural, that's fine. And you don't think that about the spider. You're not saying, oh, it's the culture of the spider that makes the spider dream. No, you think universe is dreaming a spider, but not in us. But that's not plausible, is it? And that's why philosophy is changing in the way it is. And then in the same way, there are massive changes underway, and I'll hurry this up, in the sciences, and I go through most of them, and I won't do that now. You can ask questions about different ones. The emergence of real time, shaking the whole of Newtonian physics, real time. The end of locality, that's all over the scientific literature. The end of locality. So if you're a clergy person and you've got a kid says, well, I'm an atheist, what you need to say to that child is, well, you believe in common sense. All you're saying is there's no God in the world of common sense. Well, there's no God in the world of common sense. That's fine. The world of common sense doesn't exist. Locality's just failed. You see? This is an example of scientific change blowing the media class and the commentariat out of the water. Now I can go on to biology and theoretical biology and quantum biology, and I can go to the new social ontology, which Peter knows about, which is extremely interesting, the work of the Australian philosopher Pettit. I can go into radical plasticity. Now everybody knows that literature, I think, but they don't see the link with the earth, even though Clive Hamilton's been telling us for the last 5 years. Everybody knows the body's plastic and the mind's plastic, blah, blah, blah. That's well known. But the Earth's plastic too. That's the whole point about the Anthropocene. It isn't a steady object in space that was always as it is now. It's a set of matrices that can realize different possibilities under different constraints. Now, as I'm going forward, you'll begin to get the point, I think, that the changes are unimaginable, and they go through 25 different disciplines, and only one person can know much about any one of them, and nobody can know about all of them. Certainly I don't. But they do cause us a problem, because if we go on with the sort of religious thought we developed in the modern period, we're going to find ourselves not handling the changes well, and not connecting with the sciences well. And that's my point to you. Now I think there's no need for that, so I'm now going to introduce you 6 perspectives, rather quick, rather fast, all amazing, but you'll see the point of them. Because I think if we stop for a moment, we can all see modern religious thought was wonderful, but it is fading away, not because of disbelief, not because of irreligion, but because it's aging like anything else in the world. It's had its moment for it, and now we have to come up with something new. Well, what could we come up with? Well, I'm going to give you 6 contributions. It isn't the answer, it isn't the alternative, it isn't the prophecy. These are things that will be in the mix, however the mix is made, and I don't know how the mix will be made, obviously. First one is a new naturalism, and I've written a bit about that, and I just want to make one point about that. That we need a new naturalism, not controversial. All over the world people are seeing that because the science shows that's absolutely right. The modern world conception is clearly false. Biology and physics both show that quite clearly. The problem is what to develop instead. And I want to add one bit to that for the theological people. I think we should argue for a new supernaturalism. And that's really rattling the chain of secularism. I think that supernaturalism is true. I think that the new naturalism will show that supernaturalism is true. That's a bit of a shock, isn't it? But to do that, I have to hit you with the idea of counterfactuality. See, back to the poor old spider dreaming again. Because you think counterfactual is a terrible mess. You mustn't have counterfactuals. You've got to keep it sensible and down to earth. You know, and either there's a cow in the paddock or there's not. Well, okay. But is there space-time? Can you define matter if 90% of it's missing? Okay. So the new supernaturalism requires a reinterpretation of counterfactuality and projectivism. Now, I'll just leave that, but you'll see that what I'm saying essentially is that naturalism is not the problem. The problem is that the naturalism we've adopted is superstitious, mythological, and uncritical. A good naturalism will support a supernaturalism by showing that living entities use counterfactuality and projectivism in their evolutionary path. Obviously, the spider does. I don't think I have to go far to say we do. Okay. Now, the next bit is the need for a new philosophical anthropology, and that's not controversial. All over the world this is discussed. The key figure there is Plesner. It's an example of something I say a lot, I know, but I have to say it again here too. Most important books aren't in English. And Anglo-Saxons don't quite get that. And they think, well, I've read the books in the library. Well, maybe you have, but unfortunately there are 20,000 more books not in your library. And many of them are not in your language. And it's particularly bad in the case of German, because German does have good books on many topics. They're not translated, and when they are translated, you might as well throw them in the bin, because high German doesn't go into bad English. Now, I don't want to go through that great detail today, but I just want to stress philosophical anthropology. That's Helmut Plesner, the greatest figure in the field of the 20th century, had 3 doctorates. studied with Husserl, studied biology, also had a massive knowledge of all sciences, wrote about 14 major volumes, was discovered about 4 years ago in the United States, and is now a hot figure because everybody's realizing, my heavens, this man Plesner knew everything and had a coherent account of the human being. A wrong account, I won't go into that, but a project that's so strong that all over the world people are saying, well, mightn't we need something like that? Yes, we do. Yes, he was on the road. The next example is formative cognition. Now, this is extremely controversial in theological circles, but it shouldn't be, because Sarah Coakley's written a wonderful book, The Spiritual Senses. Kevin Hart, the cleverest Australian poet, has a wonderful new book on Richardson Victor. The whole Christian tradition, starting from Paul, is riddled with formative cognition. But Christians have run away from it. Partly because of a stupid historical mistake. They got worried about Gnosticism because they thought there were Gnostics. Well, I won't go through that, but the literature shows that Gnosticism is an incoherent muddle. It's not clear who the Gnostics were, and certainly Gnosticism didn't have the character we thought it had. We listened to the critics rather than to the people themselves, etc., etc., etc. But I'm not arguing for Gnosticism, but I am saying that a serious approach to cognition grasps that cognition is formative. Now, everybody knows that it's got a child. Everybody knows that. That's why you turn the computer off. Cognition's formative. But we haven't taken up the task. And historically, theology did do that quite a lot, and we've forgotten. The time is to return to formative cognition. That's the answer to online, digital. That's the answer to computerization. That's the answer to rotten schools and bad universities. Formative cognition. And that's something Christians have to provide, or the revelation won't really occur. That's my view of that. That's controversial. That's what I think about that. Now, I now go into detail, and I won't go into it here, but I'll just flash it to you. What I'm saying involves a reinterpretation of the whole of German Romanticism and German idealism, and that's underway. There are new books about all of this in all languages now, because it's clear we never understood any of those people. The translations are dreadful as usual, and we didn't get what they meant. I mean, Kant, Hegel, Fichte, Schelling, they're all talking about formative cognition. They're talking about Geist. They're talking about reines Denken. Now that doesn't go into English, pure thinking. What on earth is pure thinking? Well, I don't know, and you don't know, but they wrote about it. And they didn't write a couple of lines. You see, again, when you go to the library, 3 books, say, in English by Schelling. Yeah, but there are not 3 books. There are 120 volumes by Schelling. They just didn't do any of the others. And yes, it covers all disciplines. Hegel had all the science of the 19th century, like Marx. Schelling, who's my man, wrote about everything. And I mean, you can never ever get to the end of this. It's hopeless. And I don't want to take you into the forest of German idealism because I think it's nonsense. But I do want you to see the deep point. Yes, I think it's nonsense, but that doesn't mean it's not important. Because what they saw was that it would be possible to form an entirely new philosophy if you believed in the power of thinking and imagination. This is what they thought. They thought you could have a new philosophy which is specific to the human being, which depends on the development of noetic. Now that, of course, is quite close to forms of Neoplatonism in the ancient world. It's an idea that occurs in China and India too, and Tibet. And they argue for this in enormous length. And gradually people are translating the books. And I'm not suggesting we'll become German idealists, no, no, no. But we will get the message that there's something very important going on here, because it could help us with our problems. The best book on that recently is an Englishman, Peter Dew's, Schelling's Late Philosophy in Confrontation with Hegel, 2023. Best book ever written in English on Schelling. Wonderful book. Showing, and this is the late lectures at the end of his life. He goes to Berlin to refute Hegel. He's brought in to show that atheists are wrong, theology is true, Christian revelation is true. He does all that in the Berlin lectures. Intellectual Europe comes to listen to them. They only last for 2 lectures and they go home. Kierkegaard is in the audience. So is Engels. So you can imagine everybody's there. They can't understand one word. No one's understood one word ever since, but now there's a wonderful book, and now Fordham University, God bless it, is translating for the first time a proper edition of the late lectures. Well, what's it all about? I can't go through it now, but it's basically saying reality is not anterior. We have inherited a very dangerous idea from antiquity, that reality has a structure which is anterior, and then things flop out like possible to actual. But in fact, Schelling shows you that's a wrong ontology for reality. It's not anterior. And as it drops out, you construct anteriors that are counterfactual. So you can see this is a revolutionary contribution to science and philosophy that Schelling tries to make. Now, the next example is legal pluralism, and I won't go into that in terms of time, but I'll say a little bit. A radical critique of modernity is necessary. Modern theology tried to catch up with modernity, tried to appear modern. From Schleiermacher onwards, I think it's a total mistake. I think we should be saying modus makes no sense. Modus means just now. That's an irrational notion. You can never arrive at the just now that is just now, because when you arrive at it, it's gone. And the whole of modernity is based on a false theory of time and a disintegration of the human being. We have to attack all that. It's also based on ontological passivity towards the sciences, and theology is guilty of this in the extreme. When sciences appear, you bow down and worship. Well, in one way you've got to do. Of course you've got to, in any sense. But there's a deeper point. You have to have a political sociology of your sciences, and we haven't got it. And then you have a metaphysical criticism of the mythologies in which they're written. And I have many world-class scientists in my family, and I have a lot of fun with this, because if you say to them, for example, well, what evidence is there that there is any matter of any kind? They look very worried. And then you ask them to define matter, and they say it's energy. And you say, well, that's, you know, the greatest non-definition ever asked. And then you press them a bit harder, and you realize they can't define matter. And then they finally say, well, all scientific concepts don't have any reality. That's just stuff we tell the kids. They're mathematical expressions, that's all. We don't know. When they say, for example, there are no atoms, there are no particles. No, this is all just fantasy for the masses. Well, fine, but what are they really asserting metaphysically? And the answer is they don't know. And what they try to say is incoherent. Well, we should have worked that out a long time ago and did the relevant metaphysical critique and the relevant political sociology, because modern science is the product of modern capitalism. It's not a neutral view of the world, as every indigenous person in the world has been saying for a long time, and we're finally listening. Doesn't mean we've dropped modern science. The whole of my talk depends on a very positive relation to science, as you've seen. But we shouldn't be accepting the mythology in which it's written. And maybe the last point, because I'm running out of time, we need in our new religious thought a new post-secularism. Some people have heard me say a little bit about this before, but I'll just say a bit more about it today. Post-secularism is often thought to be the return of religion. Now, I don't think religion is coming back. I think if you define religion as a particular sort of historical, cultural, formative system, then I think it may be passing. I can't say that it's a prophet, I don't know. It's not passing in a clear way in the Islamic world, it's not passing in the Hindu world. You might say, and this is me being very nasty, certainly not passing the secular world. Secular people are much more religious than religious people are in Australia, and that's one of our problems. But I think that it's important to develop a critique of secularism. I think we have to be able to say that secularism does not support the human being, provides no adequate symbolic care for the human being, and eventually corrupts all the major activities in human life. We see it in our own society, where you see the aged care homes, which are catastrophic. You see the people unable to buy houses, which is catastrophic. You see work conditions being eroded in every industry in the country, so that people come away from work feeling exhausted and complain that they're having to work 60 hours a week, not 40. Okay, well, what we need to do instead is to return to the correct religious intuition that human beings are spiritual beings. And therefore all human institutions need to express their spirituality. And there's no use having a church on the hill that does it an hour a week. Everything in the society needs to do it. And it needs to do it because this is what human beings are really like. You can try the opposite, and we have, and the result is horrible. I look at the degree of mental illness among young people in Australia, 1 in 4. Look at the situation of women in the United States, young women. Tremendous depression and anxiety. Look at older people in the United States on opioids. I can go on and on and on. So I'll try to bring this to a rational conclusion, and then I'll end up, 1 minute at a time, on the spider and the dreaming. So what I'm saying is the new religious thought will have to take account of the challenges we face. That's clear. It will have to take the natural sciences extremely seriously. That's clear. It will have to take the new technology seriously. That's clear. But I don't think it should retreat in the way it's retreating. And I don't think it should think that going secular is the answer. I think insofar as churches go secular, they are going to go out of existence. I think the answer is the exact opposite. To say that human beings are spiritual beings, and then to say something very worrying. They're spiritual beings in a universe that must be spiritual too. And we haven't thought that at any time in modern thought, really. A few lunatics on the fringe, certainly. But mainline people, very sensible people, Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, human beings spiritual, oh, but no, the sun and the moon are. That's for the kids, or the Sioux, or something, isn't it? Well, no, I don't think it is. I think spirituality in human beings comes from the universe. It's the universe that's spiritual, not just us. And that dualism that we've lived with in modern thought is a mistake. And you can see that, and I'll end at this point, and of course the implication is we have to change all our institutions so that they're not modern. So they're adequate to our spirituality. And that so they relate to our evolutionary progress. Because our present institutions impede our evolutionary progress. We're actually getting worse. Look at climate change. But everything I'm saying really comes back to the spider again, so in the spider dreaming, come right back. Because if the spider dreams, you begin to see that this is not just a piece of trivia for the science class. This is an indication that something that you had made central to your humanist anthropology is central to natural process. And that means that your humanist anthropology, as it came out of the Renaissance, isn't adequate to the universe we're in. And once you see that, then you can see, okay, well, what would happen if we rethought the universe we're in, taking imagination as an essential guide to it, but not treating it as odd, queer, or exceptional, but seeing it as more central to the universe that we're in. Now, I'm not the only person in the world, of course, to say that, and if you wanted to, you could put up your hand and say, isn't that in some way what C.S. Lewis is talking about? Isn't that what Tolkien is talking about? And there's some truth in that. There's some truth in that. Where I'm adding to them, if you like, is that I'm wanting to include what they say in a wider naturalism. Now, some people get frightened by the word naturalism because they think it means atheism and anti-religion and reductionism and all this thing. That I think that's all nonsense. They don't look. I mean, it's really silly, really. I mean, if you go to most Australian scientists and start talking about the universe, you'll be shocked how little they look at it. But if instead of that you look at it, and this is the point about phenomenology, this was Goethe, if you're into that stuff. See, what Goethe tried to say is that Newton's all right, it solves a few problems in maths, but it's totally wrong as an account of the way the universe is. And Goethe's now won that argument. Everybody can now see, well, yes, he's right, of course. But when you look at how the universe is phenomenologically, Goethe's point emerges. That the universe that we're in, physically, experientially, is Goethe's universe, not Newton's universe. Right? And when you attend to that, then you see that we experience imaginal reality. Of course we do. But that's because we're imaginal beings. But if we're imaginal beings who experience imaginal reality, we are not unlike the spider dreaming. And that enables me to conclude by saying that modern religious thought was wrong about the universe, and therefore wrong about the human being. And we should change that. Thank you very much.
Okay, we now have an opportunity to ask or answer questions, offer some comments, observations, criticisms. I don't think we might be pushed back a little. But we do need a courageous soul who's willing to engage one of the 3,000 ideas that were just given. Peter, did I see a hand?
Yes, you did.
Please open the conversation for us.
I point out the end of your presentation, Wayne, which I thank you very much for. You used the phrase expressing spirituality, and it brought me back to what I think is a major issue underlying everything that you're saying, and that is that there is an arm wrestle between language and metaphysics. And if I can make that point, I perhaps can put something to you that you might want to contest. And that is that in this regard, philosophy is making glacial progress. That is, it's 100 years ago last year that Wittgenstein's Tractatus in the second aphorism raised the issue of what must the world be like for language to have sense, as opposed to what we had been struggling with, and that is, what must language be like for reality to have sense? So the point I'm making is that if you go back to the Oxford of the 1980s and Michael Dummett takes the Wittgensteinian argument about private language and moves to reality from language. This is what reality must be like for language to make sense. Are you venturing down the path of a reflection and a solution that encompasses the issue of metaphysics and its arm wrestle with language in this
Thank you,
regard?
Peter. That's, of course, a terribly deep and difficult question to ask anyone. I can, I think, reply to it fairly clearly because I'm interested in it, of course. I was a friend of Michael Darwin. I do know about these disputes to some extent, though I'm not working on them at the moment. I think this idea that, you know, we must ask how the world is like for a language to be possible is absolutely right. I think that's 100% right. And I do think that's a huge step forward. I agree with you completely. The only qualification I'd throw in there is that, of course, there are all kinds of languages, not only human language. And, of course, Wittgenstein's thinking about human language. So we have to have a more universalistic concept of language, including all mathematical languages, all sign languages, and so on and so on. But the point still holds that whatever system of communication you find in the universes will be indicative of characteristics of the universe. I think that's right. And the reason I think that is that I do think I'm sympathetic to the new metaphysics of disposition on this one. I go down the discriminatory. I don't think that things happen in the universe by chance. I think they happen because the universe has a certain structure that makes that particular set of possibilities privileged in those. I mean, water goes down the hill. You can stop it by making a dam, but it goes down the hill. That's because the dispositionalities favour water going down the hill. So I do agree with that, but I would widen it to more than human languages, so that's that point. And reflecting a lot of what I said today, of course, when Wittgenstein was writing, we did think, really, that semiosis was something relevant to human beings and their languages. But now we know that semiosis is a general phenomenon of nature, and that's the Tartu school, if you're interested in biology. They've now shown that semiotic communication across the whole of the universe. It's found in all. As soon as you have sentience, you have semiotic communication. So this shows that the thesis is true, but it's of a wider extent than we thought. And I agree strongly that attending to these matters will help a theological project by showing us that the universe is not, you know, the idiot common sense universe. A lot of what I'm saying is saying to people, why do you think that there's a bit of a field out there with two cows in it? There's nothing wrong with thinking that, but it's not a deep metaphysical truth that there's a field out there with two cows in it, because it doesn't hold in the quantum universe, obviously. We need to think about the universes we're in. I didn't play the card today, but I'm interested in polycosmism. I don't think we can accept the modern idea there's one universe. I think that's got scientific problems and all kinds of other problems. But as I go on, you begin to see that all the objections someone would make to Christianity from an atheistic point of view fail, on my view, because they can't get their points up. Because all their points require a kind of ontology of common sense that isn't deconstructed. It's why Dawkins can't actually argue for science for anything he says. That's also why he's becoming a proto-Christian. You may have seen that. His new books have big chapters on Jesus.
Scott? You're rejecting the modern world, but you're showing a very modernist tendency in your favouring creative destruction. So I'm interested in how radical does this newness of religious thought have to be? How can it be a bit hermeneutical and respect the past, or does it have to be creative destruction? And I'm thinking of four 19th century figures in the English-speaking world: Charles Sanders Peirce, who's on your semiotic point. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a great theologian of imagination, and two Roman Catholics, John Henry Newman and Gerard Manley Hopkins. Now, the last two, would you have to say, share your sense that the mind inhabits reality, and yet they're both able to respect and develop the richness of the Catholic tradition. So can we do that, or can we not do that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, the breakism in what I'm saying is just a rhetorical joke, obviously. I mean, nobody thinks that we break from the past in that sense. No one. I'm not sympathetic to modernism, obviously. You heard that in the bit about Modo. I mean, obviously, I'm not sympathetic to modernism. What I'm saying isn't a break with the past. In some ways, it's fair to say that Scott's absolutely right. It's a fulfilment of the past. But it's a fulfilment of bits of the past we didn't listen to enough. And the four people you name illustrate my point devastatingly, because three of the four were Scotists. You see, not only are they traditional, but they followed bits that we, out of laziness, had left aside. Now when you say Scotus to an evangelical audience, it may sound Roman Catholic, but you have to know that after the Reformation, the Lutheran universities went Scotus. It's not a point about the Reform, it's a point about good philosophy and bad philosophy. Scotism is not wonderful theology in my view, I'm skeptic about that, but it's very strong philosophy and I want to bring it back. Now what's good about it, I won't go into it today, but Scotus is a very, very powerful logical thinker. It's hard to understand him, but what he gives you explains why science works. That's why it's important. If Scotus is right, science can work. If Scotus is wrong, you have a mystery on your hand that isn't helpful. Now you find that in Peirce, who was a Scotus, and also, by the way, a follower of Schelling. You find it in, who is your next person?
Coleridge.
Coleridge is the only person in England who takes up Schelling. He's the person who introduced Schelling into the English-speaking world, and for exactly the same reason that he can see that Schelling is not just talking about imagination like romantics do altogether, but implying that imagination is part of nature, that this is actually how universe works. Coleridge gets it right in one. Then you had Newman. Newman, I think, is covered by the Scotus point, and Hopkins is 100% Scotus. So you could say this is a very conservative view I'm giving. That would not be unfair. You could describe it as a medieval view, but it's not the medieval we went with, you see. For in the medieval ages, as you probably know, the dominant theology was Scotism, not Thomas. The idea that Thomas is important occurs much later, and in a way is a great mistake. I'm not hostile to Thomas, but Gilson's Thomas is nonsense, and the whole Catholic world's been driven mad by mad ideas that Gilson developed. Scotus is much better because Scotus thinks, of course, that God always wanted to create the world, that God always was going to send his Son, and that love is the key to the constitution of every aspect of matter and every aspect of the universe. I mean, he has a theology that will work for science, and we should return to it. So there's a very old-fashioned side to what I say. Yes, thank you.
Sati.
Thank you, Wayne. In fact, much of what you said, I was reminded of some of Panikar, whom you know really well, particularly the supernaturalism, the ways in which you actually look beyond secularity and secularism. And of course, I'm also a student of Gordon Kaufman, because all of his theology is imagination. But the question I have really comes from something that I found missing. You took us everywhere. But you actually left out what is a reality that affects the life of many in our world, which is economics. And let me put this differently. Let's go with the spider dreams. I think this captures very well, metaphorically, what you're actually doing. The concern for many in the world is the spider spins, and it has a web in which there is entrapment. So the idea is something that is really this whole idea of counterfactual actually being part of a construction of reality that could be, I agree with. But the problem is much more the economics that basically then has victims within its web that it spins. How does one actually work between the counterfactual and the anti-life factual? So the idea of basically, and this goes back to I think what you've done wonderfully well, to bring the integration of all of creation, but the idea of life and the thwarting and the trapping of life that one sees economically is not sufficiently accounted for. And I'm just wondering why.
Well, it's in the paper, but I had to get it in 30 minutes. And I bought the book for you. The best book on that is a book from Japan by Saito Marx and the Anthropocene, which will give you the new Marx and explain how that leads into a detailed response to the Anthropocene and to detailed ideas for the next ecological civilization. So nothing I say is incompatible with anything you say, it's the same thing. I just make one big point about that, which is that this, of course, is exactly what Marx was saying from the very beginning, because Marx writes to Ruger at the very beginning of his career that the world already contains, in the form of a dream, what needs to be realized in reality. And that's very strong in the German, Traum der Sache. Sache there is not translatable, but in the form of a dream. It's stronger, it means the content, not just the form. That's the meaning of it. And he's already saying what you're saying. And on the other 2 points, Yes, I am influenced by Panikkara, it's fair to say that, I think, though I don't take his view of science. He has a doctorate in science, of course, but I think it's too Spanish. I don't, the other person you mentioned was Gordon Kaufman. Gordon Kaufman is wonderful, but he's a Kantian. I went to see him in Harvard because I had read his book and thought it was good. But in the end of the day, God in Kaufman is not a real living being. God is a hypothesis that we make because of our cognitive architecture. Now, I reject that. I'm not a Kantian. I don't think Kant's right. And I think that Kaufman's theology is too modern, too secularist. I'm much more sympathetic to your point that we need to undo the spider's web in the real world. I think that's 100% right. And I think if churches address that properly, you'd have your audience, because everybody... I mean, Peter Brown is the wonderful person here, we all know, I'm sure. Peter Brown shows you how Christianity spread. Well, it spread by bringing a better social life to the ancient world, by being ahead. They weren't there saying, well, there's a new Roman idea about marriage and we could adopt it next week if we tried. No. They were saying it's all nonsense. The Christians got up and said, we've got a higher norm. We don't buy this stuff. This is ugly and cruel. And the Roman world, to their great surprise, said, it is ugly and cruel, isn't it? This is a bit better. Read Peter Brown, and I agree 100% with Sally.
Ross?
Just before I ask my question, there's an ABC science show in the past week. I think it's the one called What the Duck. And I don't know if people heard it, but they were talking about spiders' webs, and there was an argument that there are things in the way spiders do their webs that are unaccountable, and show that, and the argument was that the spiders are doing it mostly for fun. There's a sort of playfulness that animals play. And
yes, it's the obvious.
Playful animals throw that in with the spiders. The question is, my question is, you seem keen to hang on to the term religion. Why is that? And why isn't, as part of the kind of evolution that you're talking about,
yes,
that religion itself becomes not a very helpful term, actually?
It's tricky both ways, isn't it? You see, I mean, the first point, which people sometimes overreact to, is that we now know that there are no religions in the sense that 19th century Europeans thought there were. In other words, there's no Hinduism, there's no Buddhism, there's no Aboriginal religion, there's no Jewish religion. In that 19th century sense. And of course, we should have known that, because the Jews always told us that. We just were very stubborn and wouldn't listen. They always said, Judaism is not a religion, what are you talking about? Because the 19th century European sense of religion comes from Ficino, it comes out of the Renaissance. No one had this idea before Ficino. We got it in the European world and plonked it on everyone else. Poor old Max Charlesworth got it, and after 3 or 4 books, finally realised there are no Aboriginal religions. He kept on going, he realised, no, there aren't. Yeah, so that's the negative schoolboy point. But it's not good enough, is it? Because there's a deeper point, isn't there? That human beings for thousands and thousands of years have organised their evolutionary path using what we also call religion. So there's a sense in which religion is really out there, is really in the human being, and is really in the universe. We've got to somehow sort the two senses. One is a European misunderstanding, and that's not too controversial. But on the other hand, when you look at human phenomena anywhere in the world, now in the Neanderthals, here perhaps is the best answer to you. We used to think that religion came up with human beings, but now we know Neanderthals have art. Well, if Neanderthals have art, you don't have to be very clever to realise they're going to have religion too, aren't they? So this tells us again that there's religion in an evolutionary sense that is not about socio-historical form. So the two senses of this. The first one is religion as a historical sociological form, which certainly popped up here and there, but which we extended too uncritically. And the second point is religion as an evolutionary form. And this is not a socio-historical form. This you're going to get when you get sentience. And so according to me, spiders will also have some sort of religion. And certainly dolphins, I'm confident, will have some sort of religion. And you've got to remember, we know that elephants bury their dead. See it?
Wayne, I'm going to abuse my privilege to ask a quick question that might not have a quick answer, but there will be at least time for one other person. I go back to my introduction about the scope of your thought, and this is a perfect example of how you're bringing together dozens of disciplines and knowledges together, and the summation of this breadth of learning and analysis is, I think, a compelling argument that religion is not adapting well to rapidly changing circumstances, and that some kind of adaptation will happen. But of course, we live in a world where most people are not trained to think like you. In fact, quite the opposite. We're in a highly specialised world where there aren't really economists. You have tax experts, trade experts, philosophers don't really exist in, certainly like the Platos and Aristotles. To have a career in any philosophy department, you've got to publish and do a PhD, usually in a specific thinker or one specific problem. We all know that we live in this highly specialised world, and I think the reason for that is understandable, because the entire scope of knowledge available now is beyond most people. So the brilliant minds in this room can understand what you're talking about, but I wonder the extent to which the sort of limitation of the applicability of your analysis, because the average person that is going to drive this new religious ethos or adaptation is not going to have your perspective. And I wonder, do you think it's going to be driven by that spiritual, innate spiritual impulse or intuition? I know you're not making predictions, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is, when how does your this insight you've given us, I don't see how it can possibly filter down to...
Well, it doesn't filter down, because that's not how historical sociology and culture works. If you go on a holiday, as you've just done, to Japan, you'll go and see the Buddhist gardens. And you'll like them. Everybody in the world likes them, takes photographs, and thinks, aren't they beautiful? Well, the philosophy behind the Buddhist gardens is not known to 99% of Japanese and not known to 100% of tourists. And you don't need to be able to read difficult Buddhist texts or difficult texts in Chinese or Sanskrit. But without those texts, the Buddhist garden wouldn't be there. So, in the concreteness of life, no, this highbrow stuff's not what's the key to it at all. It's not even... It's behind it, if you like, but it's not laid out there. You don't have to be able to understand what ku means in Japanese, and it means really the infinite potentiality and non-existent reality to which we return. You don't need that in order to enjoy the garden, but you do need to see the garden. That's your point. But my point is that Christianity has a way forward, which it hasn't seen. And the way forward is to start designing the new ecological civilization and confront them with two things they don't get. First of all, what you've got's no good. That's Sartre's point, and that's an easy one. But secondly, produce the better. And that sounds utopian and mad. Well, not to Jane it doesn't, because as some of us know, Christianity did that before. That's Peter Brown's point. We did it. And we took the Roman Empire, which had to be one of the biggest military successes in the history of the world, without a sword, without a knife, by having new civilizational form that was better. And in the Middle Ages, and now I'm indebted to my colleague at the back, but the Cistercians have the most extraordinary effect on the whole history of the world. And what do? Well, they pray and they do all the things Christians do, pretty useless stuff, really. They don't just do that. They train the whole European peasantry to farm. They clear every gully in Europe. And after the Cistercians, European civilization takes a new socio-economic form. So you see, it's the same as the garden example. What the ordinary person, the peasant farmer, knows is that it's time to plant the crops now. It's very down to it. Nothing to do with highbrow stuff about biology and physics and ancient languages and German philosophers. Nothing to do with any of that. But it wouldn't have been there without the Cistercians. They did it. And they did it out of a high tradition. That's the point. In very simple, and this is a terrible thing to say in Australia, and I keep on saying it in Australia because I agree with Patrick about that, but it's something we're slow to learn. Highbrow is very practical. And Australians keep getting that wrong and think, you need to be practical, not highbrow. Well, that's nonsense. Think about physics. Think about your motor car or your TV set or your computer. I mean, nobody thinks your computer's impractical. And no intelligent person thinks you could have it without some pretty sophisticated science. So in this too, we need to produce the high stuff here and the outcome over there. That's right. But what it means for Christianity is that we should organize our funding, which includes hundreds of trillions of dollars, and stop putting it into doing social service work that we're not needed to do. The work does need to be done, but you don't need us to do it, in many countries anyway. India might be an exception. But instead of that, we should put it into one research centre in the world that's properly funded. And in that research centre, we should say to the world, we have the new eco-civilization for you. Come and have a look. Now, if you want to see how realistic this is, go and meet the Baha'is anywhere in the world. The Baha'is are doing it on a very small scale, I admit, without much success, I admit. But they are doing it. And they're doing it all over Africa and all over Latin America. They're going into villages where there are poor people who don't even have reading and writing. They're sitting on the ground with them. And they're saying you could organise the village differently. You'd have a 50% higher yield in your farming if you adopted this tactic. Now, that's very simple stuff. But we should be doing it at a planetary level. We should be saying to the human race, you've lost it. You need new institutional forms in your ordinary life. And we're going to offer you our draft. That's the practical part of what I'm saying.
Well, thank you. I remember the story of the Russian starets who spent so much time talking with a peasant woman that some of his disciples came and said, Master, you know theology, you know philosophy, what are you doing talking with this peasant woman all the time? And he said, I do know theology and I do know philosophy. I haven't the faintest idea about how to look after chickens. My concern here, and it's been my concern with Peter Brown, for example, is that it's totally urban focused. And that there is that sense in which the life of the villages, which is only just now beginning to surface in archaeology and history, is that had an enormous impact on how Christianity framed itself. So it isn't so much that it came and said to the Roman Empire, you have got it wrong. It's that they saw in the villages an alternative to how you can structure life and relationships. So it wasn't just that we had this, we sat down with the peasant woman and learned how to look after chickens.
There are two speeches there, aren't there? And they're not quite the same speech, so I've got two answers, not one. I mean, the first answer, is the starets point. This is the holy Russian thinker who is reading all the theology and all the philosophy and is talking to the peasant woman. And of course, without getting into the Ukraine, we can see that the starets tradition in Russia did not deliver the institutional forms we all want to see. They did have beautiful churches. If you go, you must go to St. Sergius's monastery, which is one of the greatest places in the world, and you'll feel as soon as you go in, this is better than anything in Rome. But they didn't reform the ordinary life of the people, and I think we agree absolutely on that. The second thing is a more modern contemporary utopia with that rural people know things that city people don't. And in one way that's not arguable. The deep point about it, which you're completely right again about, of course, is there are a lot of rural people. And of course churches are, to a catastrophic degree, defined by urban form and urban consciousness, particularly in Latin America. The Catholic Church in Latin America never evangelized 90% of the country people. They just sat in the cities where their mum and dad were and had very good dinners and better wine, and ignored the country people of the country in many ways. But there is something to the thesis that we need a social vision that includes the rural. I won't go that far. I'd also agree that non-Western models are relevant, and there are, if you read the book, you'll find there's a whole chapter on Anandamaga. Anandamaga are the people who blew up the hotel in Sydney. They're not very attractive on first sight, but they have an entire utopianism based on the rural and displacing the primacy of the urban. And I have a whole chapter on that in the book. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that we have to include the rural in the vision, absolutely. I'm a bit sceptical about the idea that the rural peasant knows that much about how to look after chickens. They know how to do it Dad's way. But of course we need to move beyond the traditional agriculture as well as with it. But I agree that what I say in this presentation is very civic and urban-centered and shows a certain moral blindness, I think. Thank you.
Got time for one more question if someone has a burning question or contribution, observation. Or else we've solved the problems of the entire universe and
go on holiday.
Let's give Wayne one more round of applause. Thank you all for coming, and we'll have another lecture in a month's time. I can't recall who's next. Is it you, Peter?
It's Nick Glasgow.
Oh, Nikolai, who's not here. I thought he was coming. Yeah. So I think the next one's going to be on Nietzsche,
Yes.
if I'm not mistaken. So look out for that. It'll be advertised.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to see you all here.
Thank you for coming.